Hi, I'm Allison Chatharachan. You might have seen me up here in the front. I'm the director of the Cornell Institute for Climate Smart Solutions, which is one of the organizers with the Atkinson Center and with the Department of Biological Environmental Engineering of this seminar. So thanks for being here today. Peter is traveling, and so I get to do the introduction today. If you have more than one green card, please pass it up to the front. Do not write a code on it for your friend who isn't here. We will find out about it. And remember, I'll announce the code at the end. Put your name, net ID in the code on just one card. All right. So with that, I'd really like to welcome today Gay Nicholson, and she's the president of Sustainable Tompkins. And she's going to be talking today about local carbon offsets for energy democracy. And we're really excited to have her here to be speaking about how we can make change locally. So since 2004, Gay has led Sustainable Tompkins in designing and implementing an integrated program to advance the creation of a more sustainable regional community. Gay emphasizes a systems approach to working with partners to build the infrastructure and social capacity for more sustainable ways of living and working here in Tompkins County. She has also been instrumental in the founding and development of the Green Resource Hub and its SEEN, Sustainable Enterprise and Entrepreneur Network, which focuses on expanding the regional marketplace for sustainable living. Gay has an undergraduate degree with high honors in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia, and her master's and doctorate are in crop physiology and integrated pest management from Cornell University. So maybe right here in this building, you take a lot of classes.
Yes, it's amazing how nothing's really changed in this building
Yeah.
in all those years.
Yeah. So she currently serves on the boards of Solar Tompkins and the Tompkins County Planning Advisory Board. So with that, please welcome Gay.
Thanks so much. As Allison said, I have been working locally since I finished my doctorate here at Cornell. I decided to not pursue a professorship somewhere and instead see what I could do as an activist in the community. So I led the Finger Lakes Land Trust for 7 years and then started Sustainable Tompkins. It's very important that we all consider those kinds of options because now is the time for action, as you probably know. From what you've been learning in this seminar. So Sustainable Tompkins is a citizen-based organization, and we have been going since 2004. We started with a study circle and salons process, engaged a lot of people, and spun off an amazing number of different initiatives in the sustainability realm locally. That logo, the weave, stands for the triple bottom line of people, planet, profits, but enmeshed in shared responsibility. And that's what we've been trying to nurture as we've worked over the last 15 years. The different kinds of projects we've been doing have fallen into kind of three main realms of supporting the movement, celebrating it, nurturing it, funding it with our neighborhood mini grants, for example, as well as a lot of work on trying to green the economy, starting with things like just educating consumers to create demand for green products and services, to try to open up the marketplace for sustainable enterprises. But also a lot of our work has been around healthy systems, whether that's social or environmental systems. And we've tried to, the traits of the work that we've been doing, we've tried to always be an advocate for taking a systems approach, for helping people do systems thinking together to try to really comprehensively see what are the interlocking issues that we need to try to solve for. And we've had a lot of community partnerships over all these years working on different projects. Equity has been an important piece of what has been built into the local sustainability conversation, with a number of different initiatives. And again, that notion of shared responsibility, trying to reach out to not just citizen groups, but to local government, to businesses, to the campuses, to all of us that are here sharing this environment. And we've particularly done a lot of programming in the area of climate and clean energy. Again, starting with a lot of those early workshops to introduce energy efficiency and renewables to the business sector, as well as homeowners, to lots of energy fairs and energy teach-ins and climate marches, and to large conferences like our 4-day regional Climate Smart, Climate Ready conference that we did with Assemblywoman Barbara Lifton and a number of other partners. And then when we started the fracking fight, what was that, 7, 8 years ago? It was a while back. But as we started that, there was a lot of criticism of people in the anti-fracking movement for being hypocrites because they were still using their own natural gas and using fossil fuels in their home. And that was actually true for most of them. So we created the Finger Lakes Energy Challenge, which was an online platform where people could figure out what they could do in 5 different areas of, transportation, their food choices, home energy, hot water. Can't remember what the other one was. I guess electricity, and help them get started on shrinking their carbon footprints. And that has really taken off. Most of those people who were in the anti-fracking movement have now done their energy chores at home, and people are now buying electric vehicles and continuing to be very engaged in various issues, such as the working together to keep a gas pipeline from being built out in Dryden, and instead working together to educate the building sector on how to use heat pumps and smart design to heat new commercial or apartment complexes. More recently, we started the Youth Climate Challenge, which are some grants that are available to local high school kids that want to work together to do some kind of project on some aspect of climate change. And one was on solar ovens and a curriculum for 4th graders to learn how to cook with solar ovens. And another one is a very ambitious project to educate the business community about the upcoming changes in refrigeration for green refrigeration. So that's been a pretty significant project that we're working on. And most recently, we have a new partnership with Bull Rock Solar out of Vermont to offer solar electricity from a local solar farm to renters or homeowners at a 10% savings. So we're trying to make that available to folks as well, make it easy. So let's get on with this, our topic of today. And first I want to talk about putting a price on carbon, which many believe we need to do if we're going to be able to meet our climate protection goals. Whereas others think that this is only going to work if it's combined with other policies, such as subsidizing renewables, changing the infrastructure that's out there, and imposing bans on new fossil fuel infrastructure or further development using fossil fuels. There's 2 main kinds of approaches. There's a carbon tax, which many countries and some states and some municipalities have imposed or trying to make it work. A carbon tax keeps the price of carbon steady, which allows businesses to plan for how they're going to deal with managing their carbon reductions or fossil fuel consumption. But that carbon tax needs to be high enough to actually incentivize reducing consumption of fossil fuels, or you just have no guarantee that you'll ever get any emission reductions. And that's what has happened in a number of places where the carbon tax is pretty low. And then there's cap and trade emission credits. And in that case, you're setting a limit on what the emissions are supposed to be and issuing permits that can be sold by those who have reduced their carbon footprint to others who haven't managed to do that yet. And so the price will vary in that market, the price on the carbon. But again, these have tended to fail because they tend to give away way too many free credits at the beginning, like the European Union did. And in order to get anybody to participate, get businesses to be part of this trading network. And so they haven't been too effective yet either. So the motivation behind putting a price on carbon is that you want it to reflect the social cost of carbon, of climate damage. You know, the droughts, the floods, the wildfires, you know, the physical destruction, but as well as the health impacts from a warming climate. All those different costs are, you know, the cost of climate change, and a price on fossil fuel carbon ought to try to reflect that. But unfortunately, there is a big gap between the actual cost of climate damage and what the market prices are. A recent OECD study said there was a 75% gap in the United States, whereas some of the European countries, their gap is more like 40%. They've done a little better, not as energy intensive as we are. There's just really a wide range of prices that's out there, from like less than $1 a ton to $140 a ton. But a lot of them are at that lower end. And the analysis is, if we were to try to reach those Paris Climate Accord goals, the price of carbon globally needs to rise to $50 to $100 a ton in order to actually get people off of fossil fuels and get going on making that transition. I also wanted to point out that there's the cost of climate damage, but then there's also the cost of reducing emissions, and that's highly variable. Some steps to reduce fossil fuel emissions are pretty expensive. They're labor intensive. They require skilled labor, such as installing air source heat pumps, versus some of the cheap carbon reductions, such as flaring landfill gas, turning the methane into carbon dioxide, which you know, they can get paid to do, but it's also one of those things that, why don't we just regulate that and everybody has to flare their landfill gas rather than having to spend our money on that particular kind of carbon reduction. So we want to consider, in looking at all of this information on the price of carbon, you know, what are the various costs to reduce certain kinds of carbon emissions, and what additional factors should we be considering besides the price of an emission reduction? You know, are there other outcomes to consider, other benefits from doing a particular kind of carbon reduction versus flaring landfill gas? And so there have been some studies that have tried to start looking at the number of other add-on benefits that can proliferate throughout a community. I believe Peter gave you a link from me that was a study on, especially I think it was most of the case studies were in Africa in terms of reforestation projects and how that improves all these other things. So like the value of doing an offset there by planting trees had this huge pool of benefits that came with it. So there's reasons to pick some kinds of carbon reduction schemes over others is the point here. So I want to tell you about our Finger Lakes Climate Fund and how we answered some of those questions. Ours is a community-based carbon offset fund. We launched it in 2010 after researching similar efforts elsewhere in the United States. So what's a carbon offset? It's a slightly different concept than a carbon tax or the cap and trade emission schemes. It's basically a way of canceling out the greenhouse gas emissions from our lifestyles, with the concept being for every ton of carbon dioxide emitted from your travel or your building use, you can help pay for reducing a ton of carbon dioxide emissions somewhere else. To keep it from being emitted, or to store a new ton of carbon, like in reforestation efforts or soil carbon farming, for example. And of course, the search for the carbon capture and storage from coal plants, which you've probably heard President Trump promote, but it's not actually in the marketplace. So why local carbon offsets? You may have heard of some of the national offset programs that are out there. TerraPass is one that a lot of people have heard about. But I was motivated to create a local one because back in the early carbon market, I just was hearing of a lot of scams that were out there, and a real lack of transparency. There were a lot of projects around tree planting, but if nobody ever watered the trees or guarded the trees from herbivore browsing, or even, went out ever back out and looked to see if they were growing, that wasn't carbon that was reduced. The trees die, and, it wasn't a real carbon offset. In terms of transparency, I was also aware of a lot of these larger carbon offset firms that were out there that seemed to have a lot of well-paid staff and a lot of marketing teams, but it wasn't at all clear how much of your carbon offset was actually going to build that wind farm. What percent actually made it to helping make a carbon offset happen. So transparency, I felt, was an issue. And then there were some outright frauds. I remember reading about a factory in China that was built to pollute, so then they could get money from the EU to change their pollution pattern. So I thought, well, with all of that going on, why don't we just make one local where we could know exactly where it was going and how it's run? So I figured it would be a lot more transparent. And it also let us then be able to connect offsetting with local action to reduce emissions in the first place. Our mantra is reduce first and then offset the rest. We don't want to encourage people. It's like selling absolution for your climate sins. We don't want to encourage people to just consume fossil fuels and pay for it because they're wealthy and they can afford it. So by combining it with all these other programs that are going on locally that are helping people shrink their carbon footprint, and teaching them about it and making it cheaper and more accessible, we're also trying to create social norms around being on that path towards shrinking your carbon footprint. But then meanwhile, since those things tend to take time, and they take their capital investments that you're making in your house, so you have to stage it. So meanwhile, you can offset your carbon emissions, and especially travel, which it can be pretty hard to figure out how you're going to green that up, especially air travel. And that's where most of our offsets are, is in that air travel area. But another thing that motivated me was this concept of energy democracy. You've probably heard of climate justice. The global climate movement has been adamant about that high emissions countries like our own have a moral obligation to protect vulnerable communities around the planet that have done little to create the problem of all this climate damage and aren't responsible for it. So those that were responsible for it should help pay for either disaster relief or the mitigation that's needed to bring down emissions. sure you've all heard of all the flooding in Bangladesh and how they and other coastal communities are, and the Pacific Island nations are all going underwater, and they weren't the ones that caused it. So this was a conversation that we started way back in for the first Rio summit in '92, when, for the first global climate negotiations. It's been pretty hard to convince the rich to pay for the harms that they cause, but the demand for justice hasn't gone away. But so there's the climate justice, which I imagine you've been hearing about, but then there's this other concept that I think we also need to consider, how we manage the process of leaving fossil fuels behind within our communities. The disruption that we face from climate change is going to require a lot of social cohesion in order to get through it together, to be resilient in the face of lots of different changes, whether those are weather disasters or influx of immigrants from elsewhere and creating housing price problems, that kind of thing. We're going to have a feeling that we're in it together. And so therefore, I wanted to find ways to build in, including lower income members of our community, in that transition to clean energy. There's been a lot of critique of the renewable and green energy movement for being elitist, in that it costs money to buy solar panels for your house and electric vehicles and geothermal heat pumps. And that's true. Those are expensive investments. We need to find ways to make sure that everybody can have the pride of contributing to addressing the threat of climate damage in our community. So that's why our focus has been on carbon offset grants to help modest income households in our region reduce their carbon footprints and start weaning themselves off fossil fuels too, while also getting to save money on their energy bills and making their homes more comfortable as well as healthier. Because a lot of these types of improvements also help address asthma and other issues that people are suffering from. So we focus on homes also because a lot of the market forces and policies are already bringing down the price of solar and wind really rapidly. And so we don't need to do as much over in that sector, whereas we have a lot less regulatory leverage over the emissions that are coming from buildings. Governments just really haven't invested much focus or political will and courage to start regulating what happens in buildings beyond just standards for new buildings that are being built. And yet the building sector is really critical in terms of meeting our climate goals. The greenhouse gas inventory for Tompkins County shows that 55% of our emissions are coming from buildings, commercial and residential buildings. So, and in our area, you've probably looked around, a lot of those buildings are old, they're leaky, they're not insulated very well. And so there's a value in tackling that particular problem, because just even a first round of some air sealing and insulation work in a house typically will reduce emissions by 30%. So it's really good bang for your buck in terms of a place to focus on. And of course, also, we're trying to help people who are lower income, who would have a hard time paying for that on their own. I don't know if you're aware of Tompkins County's leadership on energy and climate in New York State. We were the first ones to add an energy element to our comprehensive plan, and then the first ones to develop a energy roadmap for how are we going to get to the adopted goal of 80% emission reductions by 2050. So I was part of the steering committee for this energy roadmap, and you can see that on the top half of that arrow, it's about buildings that we have to pay attention to. And when we worked with Cornell faculty and grad students to work out these different scenarios of how are we going to get to our goal. And you can see that all of the scenarios that are not business as usual the third one down, the percent of projected energy demand provided by efficiency improvements is 25 to 31% under whatever scenario we pursue. So it's worth paying attention to how are we going to do that. So what's our process? How does our Finger Lakes Climate Fund work? Basically, you start with people who are willing to take responsibility for the carbon emissions and offset. And so we have lots of local residents, but as businesses, nonprofit organizations, church groups, people on campuses, as well as local governments. They have all been part of this effort to learn how to take responsibility for our carbon emissions. So people just go to our website and use our carbon calculator to figure out what do they owe for their emissions. Then as that money accumulates in our fund, we work with local energy contractors to have them apply to the climate fund for a grant based on the number of tons that particular work scope that they're doing is going to eliminate from insulating air ceilings, which would be heat pumps, whatever the improved set of improvements are, or solar panels or whatever. And then we have a grant making committee that reviews all of that, and I calculate, from the energy savings, I turn that into carbon dioxide savings and figure out what the grant award will be. And so far we have given out 30 grants worth almost $50,000, and they have cumulatively offset 2,350 tons of carbon dioxide in Tompkins County and 5 of the surrounding counties. A lot of people work here in Ithaca but live in other counties. And as I mentioned, we have a few renewable energy projects as well as the home energy efficiency ones. So there's our portal for the carbon calculator. If you look across the top there, you'll see the carbon calculator that you can pick. And we wanted to design something with an emphasis on quick, easy, and affordable, so that people wouldn't feel like it was too much of a chore to figure out how to offset some of their carbon. And you can see here some examples of it's $25 or so to fly to the West Coast and back. 500 miles of typical car travel is only $5 to offset that. Your typical monthly home energy is about $15 to offset. So that's affordable for a lot of people to take on some piece of their emissions and do some of them. So our price is $25 a ton. That's the price we've put on carbon. How did we get to that? Well, partly by looking at the market for carbon offsets when we were setting this up, looking at what are other people charging, and also by surveying locally of what would people be willing to pay for their carbon offsets. We had started at $20 a ton, but then back in 2015, we raised it to $25 a ton because carbon prices are going up. We're trying to send a message that carbon costs us collectively, and that we all need to share responsibility for those costs. But if we go too high, then fewer people will participate. So it's this balancing act. While it's still this voluntary market in the US, outside of the utility sector where there are some mandates that they have to work with, we're likely to see that price increase over time as people get a little bit more used to the idea of taking responsibility. But also, again, the reality is that the cost of carbon is going up all the time. The further we progress into climate change, the more expensive, the more damage, the more we're looking at having to try to repair. So, it's this complex, dynamic framework that we're working in, but I just thought, well, let's just get started with it, and we'll adapt as we go along. So here's this idea that your local carbon offset is going to help those that are in need. So how can you be sure that that's really going to happen? Well, although the carbon markets are a voluntary market, there are several criteria, standards that have been agreed to that assure donors that the emission reductions actually happened. One thing is that they need to be measurable. We need to know what exactly is the emission reduction that's going to happen. And some projects are hard to measure, like trying to educate consumers about their options. But other things are quite valid in terms of having lots of data, years of experience to know exactly what these different energy efficiency measures are going to produce in terms of energy savings. And of course, the specs on solar and wind, that's quite well known. So measuring is not so hard to do in the building sector. But the next thing is, how can we verify that the work actually took place? And we piggyback on the state's energy programs. NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Development and Research Authority, and they're the ones who hand out the money for all sorts of different energy related projects, but they have ongoing programs that provide grants to lower income households. And they train and certify the contractors so that we can be sure that they know what they're doing and are working to professional standards. And they hire third-party verifiers that check up on the work of the contractors. So instead of us having to do all that, which would really be expensive, we just piggyback on what the state is already paying for. And also our secret weapon is Ian Shapiro, who is the founder of Tatum Engineering. Tatum stands for technology as if the earth mattered. And so Ian is really literally written the book on quality assurance and home energy efficiency measures in the building sector in New York State. So he's on our grant making committee and reviews all of this material and helps educate the contractors on where they can do even better. But lastly, the last concept is additionality. You don't want to pay for something that was going to happen anyway. And so the concept is the carbon reduction project needs to be unable to happen at that scale without the infusion of offset money. You know, I'd heard of sort of hostage taking approaches where, you know, we'll cut down the forest unless you pay us to offset it. And you know, so there's some of that kind of thing that goes on out in the marketplace that you want to be, you know, careful about what you're paying for. And I don't know that giving money to offset already profitable wind and solar farms anymore is a good offset in terms of additionality. But that's a thing that's kind of, it's difficult to prove. Would it have happened if they hadn't had your offset dollars? And when it comes to lower income households, we didn't want to be intrusive or burdensome with paperwork in, you know, requesting evidence that they can't afford to do the energy improvements on their home. So therefore, we assume that if they're earning less than 80% of the median income for their household size in our county, they probably need the carbon funding. Most of our grantees qualify for assisted home performance, where the state will match them $4,000, you know, 50% match up to $4,000. But a lot of people are pretty strained in their budgets, and so they have a hard time coming up with their 50% of that match or affording the monthly payments on a loan for that much. So our offset grants, which are often 15-20% of a work scope, make that suddenly very feasible. So they're able to proceed. So where does that money go? Well, as I said, we keep our overhead as low as we possibly can by piggybacking on the state's programs and by having volunteers like Ian Shapiro to do the review of it all. And we also have been lucky to have support from the Park Foundation every year to pay for all of the outreach and marketing that's had to go on to try to teach people about carbon offsetting. And in that way, we just take 20% to actually run the program in terms of handling the offsets and making the grants and doing that piece of it. So want to look at how it works. There's the website again with a carbon calculator at the top, and you can offset a variety of emissions: air travel, car travel, building energy, or even quick offsets. Some people offset all of their travel, and some people just do, one or two things, whatever they can afford. But you can kind of fill up your shopping cart there with different trips or your home energy use. Or as I said, or you can let us run the numbers. If you don't want to go dig out your utility bills or check your odometer, you can just pick some of the common monthly or yearly offsets for a typical New York home. So who offsets their carbon? As I said, there's a real variety. A lot of people offset their vacations because that feels like especially as a place where they can take responsibility for their emissions. But we've had honeymoons offset, visiting the grandkids, family reunions, just a wide variety of travel that people have taken. But also a lot of people will offset their trips to conferences. And Park Foundation, for example, every year they do an annual offset of all of their travel that everybody associated with them did in that prior year. And some of the businesses have offset their fleet travel when we've done particular campaigns like Purity Ice Cream, Halco, Renovus. A lot of the energy contractors have participated in that. I remember when the Chase Construction offset all the travel for a conference Cornell hosted on green facility management, and they took on offsetting everybody who came to that conference. Or you can even make a gift of a carbon offset. When the person who was leading the campus sustainability office left with his wife for a around the world journey, their friends in the office offset their emissions for that entire trip. And in terms of Cornell, the Atkinson Center for the last 3 years has offset all of their faculty travel, which we're glad to see. And some of the other departments are offsetting their seminar speaker travel when speakers come in, or like the campus sustainability office offset when they all went to a conference. But we would really like to see this increase substantially. You all know that your campus has a really ambitious goal of becoming a zero carbon campus. And a lot has been done to tighten up the buildings and reduce emissions here. But at the same time, Cornell's travel emissions have really just done nothing but go up and up and up. More of the students are traveling abroad, more faculty are traveling abroad. That's increasing for you. And so offsetting is kind of the only way of taking responsibility for those emissions. And I'd love to have all of your help in getting more of that happening now, because it's a process of learning how to remember to do it and building it into the systems of travel through your campuses, through your departments. But if Cornell were to start really offsetting all of its travel, it would be tens of thousands of dollars in offsets that we could put to work in this community and in the surrounding region that Cornell is part of. So who gets the offset grants? This is the fun part. As I said, we've given out 30 awards in 6 counties so far to a real mix of different kinds of households, quite a few single parent families. In the top left there, Linda and her daughters moved here from Hawaii and bought an old house over in Forest Home. And we're quite freaked out to find out what it costs to heat an old house. So they had to do a lot of emergency work, and it was great that they got a substantial climate fund grant to help them along in that. But also, you know, a few widows have, you know, needed some help making it just on their little Social Security stipend. So some grants have been given to them, but also to baby boomers like myself who've come back home to take care of an aging parent in some leaky old farmhouse, and you know, realize that we got to do something about this and get going on it, and they need the financial assistance to make it happen. Quite a few immigrant families, again in the top left, the Pa family are from Burma, and after they spent 10 years in a refugee camp in Thailand, they finally get to the United States, and they finally, you know, get jobs, buy their first home, and they're wearing their winter coats in the house in the winter because it's so leaky. Even though it was a like 1970s, 1980s ranch style house, it was just terribly uninsulated and leaky. And they were delighted to get some help making that place snug and more cost effective. Quite a few first-time home buyers in the, you know, that are just single, getting going with home ownership. Up in the upper right there, you'll see Adrienne Cook. She's a Cornell librarian, and she bought this 1950 Sears Roebuck kit house, which is pretty rare. And she's anticipating being snug in that when she reaches retirement by having it be a zero carbon house. So she added heat pumps and solar panels. So her house will now be zero carbon once those solar panels get up in the spring on it. Lots of young families who are lower income, just starting out. Several of them are Cornell grad students, so we're pleased to be able to help them. The Jensens in the upper right, they bought a house out in Danby or Caroline, and you know, they had snow in the dining room inside. It was that leaky, so they were, and with two little kids, they needed help getting their home safe and comfortable. We've also given out some grants to some small businesses, as well as nonprofits. The little buildings you see are Second Wind. It's a local nonprofit that builds these tiny houses for homeless men so that they can have a, you know, a safe place to live. And that was our largest grant yet. We paid for the insulation for all 6 of their first cottages out there in Newfield. But Eva Bleakley, who runs Businesses in Blooming, it's a sustainable florist shop. And when she bought the house and the building, the business and the house right next to it, wow, that was an eye opener for her of how much that house was going to need to be affordable to live in. And then the farmer that you see there, that's Cayuga Pure Organics. When their beanery burned down, and the community did a fundraiser to help them replace it. And our grant let them make it a zero carbon beanery where they process dry beans and oats. So that's who gets the grants. Well, who gets the jobs? We work with a number of local energy contractors, and we're helping support those jobs. Those green jobs they're good paying jobs, they're living wage jobs. There's a lot of training, a lot of skill involved in them. And we figure for every grant that we're giving out, they are you know, able to stay in business. So we're helping on that front as well. And in the bottom there, the guy in the red sweatshirt, he's installing an air source heat pump. And we're doing more and more of these heat pump installations, helping to make that possible. It's all part of the goal of what's called beneficial electrification, where we're trying to eliminate the need for fracked gas to heat our homes or heat our water, and also eliminate the need for gasoline to run our vehicles by switching to electric vehicles. So this is a big complex process that involves a lot of rehashing of how the grid works, and lots to be worked out, but this is a process of getting people off of those flows of fossil fuels and onto the possibility of meeting their needs with electrons from solar, hydro, wind energy. So as I said, offsets are kind of this new concept to people. So we've had to work hard to try to get offsetting to be more of a habit for people to think about their carbon emissions when they take a trip. And so that they automatically, reach for the, climate fund to make their offset. And a number of people have done that. We have people who are they always offset whenever they travel. They've learned how to do that. But we need a lot more people to do it so we can raise the money to help more folks in our community get their homes tightened up and switched over to heat pumps. So every fall we've been running the Seal the Cracks campaign to try to concentrate marketing and media coverage. The first year we had the city of Ithaca declare a carbon offset week in October, as well as the Tompkins County legislature did as well, just to bring it front of mind. And since then, a number of people have started to, in December, a lot of people do their charitable giving. So many people were seeing our, looking back over the year to see where did they travel, and they just add it all up at the end of the year. And so we are able to, track that, and people can see how we're doing in terms of fundraising in each of those campaigns. So we try to make it interesting by having offering carbon races and prizes for people to participate. So the carbon races are basically teams of people, or can be individual businesses or individuals or businesses who create a carbon race team. And then you can all be part of an effort to reach a goal together. So you can see that Ellen Harrison, who is a retired Cornell faculty member, the Friends of Ellen are in the first place right now. They've got quite a lead these days over everybody else with 61 offsets and over 500,000 pounds of carbon offset. And then the prize wheel, we get donated prizes from local businesses like Gimme and Ithaca Bakery, Cinemapolis tickets, stuff people can use. And after you make an offset, you can spin the prize wheel and see if you get a prize, just to, reward people for thinking about their emissions and remembering to offset. One of our teams is Mothers Out Front is a national organization, and they have chapters everywhere. There's a chapter down in Corning that has been formed a team and making offsets together. And we're trying to find some local awardees in the Corning area so that the money that they raise can be returned locally in some home improvement projects. I thought that you should know about at least two of the major efforts that are ongoing right now to put a price on carbon in the US. The Citizens Climate Lobby is another national group with many, many chapters around the area, and we have a local strong chapter. They have been working for, I don't know, it must be 5, 6, 7 years now with members of Congress to try to get them to pass a carbon fee and dividend, where the idea is you put a price on carbon near the source, the wellhead, the drill, the port of entry, so that everybody's prices of fossil fuel as you consume it go up. But then the money comes back in a dividend to per capita dividend to every household. And the households, of course, that have shrunk their carbon footprint and therefore aren't buying as much carbon out in the marketplace, they benefit a great deal. They get extra money back. And they estimate at least 70% of Americans, would get a refund, a dividend back. So that's the purpose of that, is to make sure that lower income people are not harmed by putting a price on carbon, because that's at the core of a lot of these discussions, is making the people who didn't cause a problem in the first place pay more, and drive them deeper into a financial hole. So they're, making some progress. They get a lot of agreement in principle, but so far there hasn't been anything passed. We'll see what happens in the House anyway in the coming year. And then at the state level, a whole coalition of climate activist groups have been pushing this Climate and Community Protection Act, which has been passed by the New York State Assembly last 2 years, maybe it's 3 years, it's passed ever since it was conceived. And this one's designed to put a price on carbon, but to return at least 40% of that specifically back out to lower income vulnerable communities and help them get their houses tightened up, get energy renewables into those communities, and also to help with any, with climate damage. And that one is built with a designed with a built-in increase in the price of carbon over time. Who knows what will actually get passed, what it will look like once it gets through the sausage factory, as they call it. But now that the New York State Senate has a Democratic majority, maybe we'll see something in the near future. Passed anyway, and then we have to figure out how to implement it. Because that one is designed to mostly go through the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State, which is notoriously understaffed. So, that they'll have to really figure out how actually this is going to be done. So in terms of next steps for our Finger Lakes Climate Fund, we have a new partnership with Heat Smart Tompkins. I'm on the board of Solar Tompkins, and we did 2 solarized campaigns in Tompkins County some years back, doubled the number of solar panels in the county. And the last 3 years, we've been working on getting heat pumps adopted, as well as insulation and air sealing as needed. And we'll be partnering with them with some additional funding, specifically reaching out to the low-income communities with a new package of extra incentives for the heat pumps combined with the carbon offset grants, and really, hopefully get a lot more low-income households on the incredibly energy efficient heat pumps, which, by the way, not only heat your house for a very small amount of energy, but they also can cool your house. So as our summers have gotten warmer, that's a new benefit that most people don't even have air conditioning in their houses. So that's coming up. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a new partnership with Bull Rock Solar, and that we can offer also to low-income households, because it's a guaranteed 10% less than what they're paying NYSEG, the utility, for their electricity. So they'll be able to go zero carbon between the heat pumps and the local solar farms. And I feel good about making sure more people, it's not just something for the rich that get to be zero carbon. We're starting to look at soil carbon farming as another kind of offset that we could do. I've wanted to do this for years, but the metrics aren't there. And I wish Cornell, those of you in the agronomy department or whatever agronomy and soil science is called these days, that would be a great project for a few master's and PhD projects to really figure out. Other places have done this, but we haven't done it in New York State with our soils, our climate regimes, our moisture regimes, for figuring out when we adopt beneficial agricultural practices like silvopasture and permaculture, we are adding carbon into the soil and storing it there. And most analyses say humans have got to learn to do this in a very big way. We see it as a beneficial thing where some of our young entrepreneurial organic farmers and silvopastorists struggle to tap, they're not as easily tapping into the big subsidies that the large agricultural corporations are accessing. So if they could get some carbon offset grants to help them, turn some manured and plowed land into silvopasture, for example, then we'd love to be able to support that. But we need metrics, and we're trying to figure out how we can do that and take some of the programs that are out in California and adapt them to New York State. But this seems like a perfect thing for Cornell to partner up with us. As I mentioned earlier, Cornell has this very ambitious climate action plan, and we'd love to be able to partner with them more with our offset program. And as I had said earlier, many of our grants have gone to Cornell grad students and employees like Adrian Cook. So we'd love to see Cornell more active in, starting this process of starting to offset your travel. So I hope that you will be joining us as we try to seal the cracks in our community. And you as individuals certainly can offset, your last trip home to your family over the holidays, for example. But also maybe you can be talking in your departments about how can your department start to have a conversation about offsetting. And I'd be glad to come up and talk with groups and just work through those details. It does already go through the Cornell business office, so that's been worked out. That's not a barrier anymore. And I hope that you'll find ways to participate here in Tompkins County, as you live here, in this work of making a better climate future for us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gay. Do we have any questions from the audience, or I can see if there's any on the webinar?
This carbon offset program you run is voluntary. Do you think that a mandatory carbon offset program could ever be feasible, like as required by the government? Maybe some.
Well, those are likely to take the form of more like that Climate Community Protection Act in New York State, where the state then would be directing where the money goes to help those most in need. And that's what's so great about this climate justice conversation that's really bubbled up in the last few years, that now finally that's being taken more seriously by policymakers, because there's been a lot of faith in the market, right? The whole reforming the energy vision in New York State was very market-based in terms of, who are the policy wonks. They have a lot of faith in market measures, and we're seeing it not working. Definitely not working for lower income people. So that's where we feel like policy and directing of where the money goes is just important. And we're trying to be exemplars of, showing the way that that's how the money should be spent.
Hi. I have a question about the heat pumps. I know a lot of heat pumps are in the south in homes. Is this a different kind of heat pump? Because I know that the efficiency of a heat pump really drops after 10 degrees or lower, and even after 40 degrees or lower. I have a house with one down in Virginia, and it's not such a problem there, but I would assume that's a huge problem here in the winter.
You're absolutely right that heat pumps started in the south, where it's they don't have the cold winters, and boy, they could sure use the air conditioning. But the technology's really been advancing in the last decade especially, and they are designing for the climates here in the north. And a lot of it is a sizing issue. Since it's new technology, we're constantly having to help contractors learn about them. And the state is starting to offer annual heat pump conferences, where you can come and get smart about this and hear from and give feedback to the manufacturers. But a lot of it is design. Heat pumps work well in especially ranch style houses. So the project I'll be doing with Heat Smart Tompkins, I'll target those smaller ranch houses that are out in the rural areas. Big old farmhouses with rooms way over here and additions and additions, additions. You'd have to put a head, heat pump head in every room, and that adds up. That's expensive. It's easier to do geothermal heat pumps in terms of being able to do big spaces like that. Because for one thing, geothermal can plug into your existing forced air ductwork, which that's what most of the rural farmhouses have is ductwork. And the earth is just much more able to bring that heat up and exchange it and keep the home warm. The difference between heat pump heat and fossil fuels, it's coming out at 160 or whatever out of a propane furnace. And, you're more at 120, with heat pumps. So you need it to be sized correctly for it to work. But also the technology is really improving. We also have heat pump hot water heaters, which are very efficient because you're not burning a fuel to heat something. You only need the energy to run the fan and the compressor. So that's why it's super efficient. I think my geothermal, which I put in a couple of years ago, hooked up to my ductwork, it was a fuel oil furnace. It's like 500% efficient when they measured. And, the best you can hope for out of a furnace is like, 95, 97% efficient. So it makes a big difference. But you're right to point to the potential for problems, and the market, is really working on that. And so is NYSERDA of learning how to design it and size it right and get the right equipment in there. Another thing that we haven't figured out yet is a lot of people have what's called hydronic systems, boilers, radiators, where it's hot water that's going through. And so they're trying to, and air source heat pumps just really don't have the power, to do that. So they're looking at combining air source heat pumps with some backup heat in order to deal with those really cold nights. And because that's maybe only 2 or 3 nights a year that you need that backup heat, and the rest of the time you're fine. So there's a lot of active research going on, but it definitely is, in the polar vortex, we've had 3 of them already, this year. And Ian Shapiro was surveying around, how are people doing? Asking both people with regular fossil fuel furnaces and people with heat pumps, is your system keeping up with, 13 below zero? And there were people that had fossil fuel systems that weren't keeping up because their houses were leaky and the system was undersized. But a lot of people with heat pumps, they were doing fine because it was right-sized and probably a nicely insulated and air-sealed building. We always emphasize that first you got to tighten it up, air seal it, get it insulated, and then figure out how much of a heat pump system do you need, how many solar panels do you need. First, shrink your demand in the first place. That's the logical and most cost-effective approach to do.
Hi. I know you said I know you said your message is always to reduce emissions first and then offset the rest. Do you feel, or have you noticed that carbon offset programs are appeasing people and discouraging them from reducing their emissions in the first place? Or
I haven't seen that so far. I mean, I don't know every single person who's done an offset with us, but I know a lot of them. Recognize their names because they're my fellow activists or they're my legislator. They're people, I've been here 40 years, so I know a lot of people. And I also know that many of them, if they are involved in the climate movement, or on the county legislature, which has passed a lot of, groundbreaking resolutions on climate, I happen to know that they've already done their energy chores at home. They've been tightening up their homes. They got solar, they participate in the Solarize command. Now they have heat pumps. Next is electric vehicle. They're on the path. And Again, most of it is air travel. And a lot of people have shrunk their air travel. You know, they just don't go, they don't fly anymore. Some individuals have done that, but most people have not done that. And I'm not going to tell, you know, I'm not going to tell my friend, no, you can't go visit your grandkids, you know. Instead, you can offset your trip and help somebody else's kids be in a nicer home.
I was wondering about how carbon emissions, like of an individual that lives in the city of Ithaca compared to someone that lives in the more rural area, and how that might compare also to like someone that lives in like a much larger city like New York City.
Well, you know, if you're in a small apartment in New York City, it's probably a much lower carbon footprint, just because of the efficiencies of scale in a big building like that. And definitely the rural houses that are the big old farmhouses have typically a pretty, you know, they're leaky, they're uninsulated. They've got great big old furnaces in them to manage that. And people didn't mind back when energy was cheap. Downtown, it all depends on the building, you know. Is it a well-built? Has it been insulated and air sealed? That really is a, one of the problems though, that maybe a better question is home ownership versus renters. People who own their homes get the benefit of investing in those energy efficiency improvements, whereas tenants don't have that control. And in a tight rental market like Ithaca's, landlords aren't necessarily incentivized to tighten up their homes because they can pass on the costs of the rising fossil fuel bills along with the rising tax bill to their tenants. And that's one of the reasons I've been an advocate for a number of years now, and we're trying to gear up to get this conversation more politically palatable once again. But I think we need minimum energy efficiency standards for all rental properties in Tompkins County. You know, we can pass that kind of a more restrictive law locally, and that would help a lot of people.
I was just also wondering about how the emissions compare, not just like through the type of home you have, but like the type of travel that like people do in rural
Sure.
versus urban areas, or like, I don't know if we're accounting for other things like where people get their food from and how that it changes among rural and urban.
Yeah, obviously people who have to commute in, and there's another justice topic right there. A lot of lower income people who work at Cornell have been pushed out of the housing market in Ithaca and Tompkins County even, and they're having to drive in from the surrounding areas with an even longer commute. And they oftentimes have older vehicles, less efficient vehicles. And so, you know, how do we, we know that we need to help on transportation, and there has been a lot of effort around bus runs and trying to figure out how to support more public transport. But that is also going to be a huge puzzle to solve together. Obviously, people in New York City walk a lot and take public transport, so their footprints are lower than upstate people. But our Seal of Cracks has just been mostly aimed at you know, the buildings, and maybe we'll start helping some young organic farmers too. That would be great.
I'll take one more question here, and then if you want to come up, and I think Gabe will stay for a few minutes.
Sure.
You talked a lot about travel and specifically air travel, but I was thinking a little bit more on the local side. Have you guys ever looked into partnering with TCAT and maybe like starting like an opt-in program when you buy your ticket of directly offsetting any carbon emissions that would happen by the rides on that ticket?
No, we haven't looked at that. That would be something to try to coordinate, especially if, you know, I know that Cornell is a partner in the TCAT system. And so that would be very interesting to see if there's a way of subsidizing, especially if Cornell was going to help, you know, with some of those offsets for people. It would be worth looking at.
Okay, thank you so much. If you did ask a question, come up and sit here, or if you have another question,
Thank you,
Okay.
Allison.
Do you offer internships for students?
Yes, yeah, we've got
Okay.
all sorts of projects.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And the word for today is Tompkins.
Oh, and I have bookmarks. If you think you might forget Finger Lakes Climate Fund, you can have a bookmark to remind you.